Hey everyone, we know how hard it can be to keep up with the latest news in Israel, so if you haven't had the time to stay on top of what's what in the Holy Land with ILTV, have no worries. It's time for our new show this week in Israel, where we'll give you the scoop on everything you need to know about the last 7 days right from Tel Aviv. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, here to keep you informed. The IDF does not mess around with threats to Israel's security, and now they're about to build a massive new barrier to combat Hamas's terror tunnels from Gaza. This enormous underground wall is the first ever of its kind in Israel. Hamas's terror tunnels have been a major threat to Israeli security and have been cited as one of the main causes of Israel's involvement in the most recent war with Gaza in 2014. But clearly, the IDF is taking their efforts to destroy the tunnels to a whole new level. For the past couple of months, Israel has set up concrete factories on the Gaza border to begin construction on a massive concrete wall deep under the ground around the Israel-Gaza border. The mission is clear: to search and destroy any Hamas tunnels that may be funneling terror into Israel. The wall is being outfitted with high-definition sensors to detect the presence of any tunnels that may be nearby, and will even extend to underwater areas of the border. The 3 billion shekel project has already contracted foreign workers from Spain, Moldova, and asylum seekers from Africa, and will be overseen by Israeli constructors for 24 hours a day, except on Shabbat, until the wall is finished. Even at the risk of angering Hamas into starting another war, the IDF clearly thinks this is a mission worth fighting for and promises that no matter what, the wall will be built at any cost.
Now, a lot of what goes on in the Middle East happens behind closed doors, but now details are coming out of secret talks that happened between Israel, the United States, and Russia to discuss the ceasefire deal in Syria and the establishment of safe zones for Syrian civilians. The talks reportedly took place in Jordan and an unnamed European capital back in early July, around the time of President Trump's first public meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit. Allegedly, top Russian and United States officials were keen on establishing safe zones in Syria, but Israel objected and instead was pressuring Russia and the U.S. to focus on removing Iran, Hezbollah, and Shiite armies from Syria first. Clearly, Israel prioritizes the long-term threat of an Iranian foothold in Syria, even at the cost of safe zones to aid displaced Syrian civilians. So when the ceasefire deal was announced on July 8th from Russia and the United States, Israeli officials were reportedly shocked to discover that all their points and requests from the meeting had been completely ignored. In fact, they were particularly disturbed that neither Iran nor Hezbollah were even mentioned in the terms of the ceasefire at all. American Secretary of State Rex Tillerson claimed last week that the United States will cooperate with Russia in Syria on the condition that Iranian forces be removed, but it looks like the theater of war and peace will continue to march on.
It looks like another major deal is going down that could mean huge changes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The King of Jordan has just met with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, and now the two sides are forming a crisis committee to address Israel's control of the Temple Mount. As Jordanian King Abdullah's helicopter landed, it marked his first visit to the Palestinian Authority in 5 years. The meeting came together very quickly in the aftermath of last month's crisis on the Temple Mount, when Israel installed security detectors at the holy site in response to the murder of 2 Israeli cops on the scene. Israel took down the new security measures following weeks of boycotts and violence, but clearly things are still fresh on the minds of the Palestinian world.
زيارة جلالة الملك عبد الله الثاني إلى رام الله ولقائه مع أخيه سيادة الرئيس محمود عباس تأتي في وقت في غاية الأهمية، حيث تم تقييم مشترك للتجربة الأخيرة التي واجهناها معا فيما يتعلق بالاعتداءات الإسرائيلية المباشرة على المسجد الأقصى ومدينة القدس، ومحاولة إسرائيل التغيير من الواقع القائم في المسجد الأقصى. تقييم هذه التجربة كانت مهمة جدا من أجل فعلا التحضير لمرحلة قادمة نحن نتوقعها من قبل إسرائيل ومن قبل شخص رئيس الوزراء الإسرائيلي بنيامين نتنياهو.
The two sides are now joining together to form a new crisis committee which intends to monitor the holy site and address any further changes Israel may place at the Holy Mount. This comes at a time when the Israeli-Palestinian peace process is at a standstill and Israeli-Jordanian relations continue to strain. So this deal will certainly have major implications for Israel down the line. With the Prime Minister's former chief of staff now part of 2 police investigations against him, you would think that Netanyahu would be sweating bullets. But even though 2/3 of Israelis are saying he should resign if police indict him, the Prime Minister is doing his best to play it cool. Former Chief of Staff Ari Harrow's turn to state witness has sent shockwaves throughout the country. Harrow has just given police significant evidence into ongoing corruption scandals against his former boss. That would be Case 1000, which accuses Netanyahu of accepting illicit gifts from billionaires, and Case 2000, which accuses him of using political power to squash an Israeli newspaper in exchange for good coverage from its rival. Police indictments may be imminent, but the Prime Minister is trying to play things business as usual and has denied any wrongdoing. Culture Minister Miri Regev has been one of the Prime Minister's most vocal supporters at a time when even Netanyahu's allies have been oddly silent.
שהממשלה נראה נינוח, שוחחתי איתו גם אתמול ובטוח בעצמו, כפי שהוא חזר ואמר, אין כלום כי לא היה כלום. אני סומכת ב100% על ראש הממשלה. צריך להפסיק עם הלינץ' התקשורתי הזה של חלקים מהתקשורת ומהאופוזיציה שעושים את כל מה שניתן כדי להפיל את הימין, כדי להפיל את נתניהו. זה לא יעזור להם. מחליפים שלטון בקלפי, לא בחקירות ולא בכותרות.
Harrow is also treading very lightly these days. The former aide to Netanyahu has reportedly told close friends that he doesn't see his turn to state's witness as a betrayal to his former boss, and that he's proud of the time he served the public under Netanyahu. Of course, Harrow stands to gain the most from his recent flip. The police have granted him immunity on his own corruption scandals in exchange for his testimony. And now 2/3 of Israelis believe the Prime Minister should resign altogether if indictments are issued, with over half the country saying they don't believe he's innocent in the first place. All right, we've been following these meetings and talks for weeks now, and suddenly it's looking like a unity government between the terror group Hamas and the Palestinian Authority might actually be happening. Hamas has just agreed to a reconciliation deal with PA President Mahmoud Abbas in an historic agreement brokered by Egypt. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has been overseeing negotiations for a unity government between the Palestinian Authority's ruling Fatah party and its rival Hamas. This would be a huge change in the Palestinian world because things have been furiously divided ever since Hamas seized control of Gaza from the PA in 2007. Now it looks like a major reconciliation deal is back on the table, and there could be a lot to gain. For Hamas, it would mean an end to the financial cuts President Abbas has laid on Gaza, and for Abbas, it would mean seeing his government's leadership restored in the Gaza Strip. But the deal isn't closed just yet. Though Hamas has reportedly agreed to the Egyptian president's deal, the terms are still being worked out. President Abbas has just sent in a counteroffer detailing his terms, and now the parties are waiting to see what Hamas will or won't agree to. The rivaling parties pulled a major win on the Temple Mount a few weeks ago by joining together to boycott Israel's security measures at the holy site. So now they're obviously realizing the power of creating a unified government. This will, of course, have major implications for Israel, but we won't know exactly what until the deal is firmly in place. Now, as we speak, police are moments away from filing corruption charges against Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, but it looks like the first criminal indictments will be for his wife, Sarah. The Israeli Attorney General will be charging the Prime Minister's wife with using government money for the family's private expenses. Sarah Netanyahu now faces 4 charges of fraud and breach of trust, allegedly for misusing hundreds of thousands of shekels of public funds to pay for her own housekeeping expenses. This includes using state money for everything from exaggerating meal expenses to covering her late father's medical expenses. She's also in trouble for buying furniture and then moving it to the Netanyahu's private home and for paying an electrician on the public's dime. Israeli police first pushed for these indictments over a year ago, but after being questioned by police last week, now it looks like Sarah Netanyahu will finally be faced with the charges after all. This is just another bad day in a series of bad days for the Prime Minister, coming just after his former Chief of Staff, Ari Haro, agreed to give police evidence against him. And now the Supreme Court has ordered Netanyahu to disclose phone calls related to yet another scandal he's suspected of. Nearly 2/3 of Israelis are calling for Netanyahu to resign if he's indicted, and things are certainly looking grim for the entire Netanyahu family.
As the doors of the Tel Aviv Convention Center opened, thousands of party members from across the country showed up to throw their support behind the Prime Minister. For an event the party spared no expense in throwing, putting at least 500,000 shekels into the night's party, it's clearly the exact response Likud's leaders were hoping for.
This is the atmosphere. Look at this, the gathering. Look at those people who came from the north, from the south, from the Druze villages, from Bedouin villages, from Arab villages, from cities, everywhere. And I came just directly from the Knesset to be here as a Knesset member and to support our Prime Minister.
This rally comes at a controversial time for the Prime Minister and his entire family. Just last week, police sealed a deal with Netanyahu's former Chief of Staff, obtaining key evidence in at least 2 corruption scandals against the Prime Minister. And his wife Sarah also faces criminal indictments for misusing government funds. But with the evening's festivities at full steam, these accusations seem to be the furthest thing from the minds of partygoers.
What do you think? Is there any truth to these charges of criminal?
Please don't get into this. I mean, it's propaganda. It's a lie, and it's so sad that because they cannot beat him in a campaign, they decided to go that way.
And as the party wore on, propaganda indeed became a familiar theme, not just from the average citizens, but from the politicians themselves.
It's become yellow media. It's not just fake news, it's full of lies. So I believe that what we need to do, we need to ignore them. They will say what they want to say, and we will show that the whole state of Israel is support us. Why? Because the truth is stronger than ever. And if in the end of the road, Prime Minister Netanyahu will need to come to court, I hope for him that he will clear his name. If he will not, he will pay like everyone. But we are not there yet.
This comes right after the latest polls revealing that nearly 2/3 of Israelis believe Netanyahu should step down from office if police decide to indict him, with only half of the country believing that he's innocent.
We are here right now, moments away from Prime Minister Netanyahu about to take the stage behind me. As you can see, the Likud party has spared no expense. We've talked with MKs, we've talked with the mayor of Jerusalem just now. Clearly, they have spared no expense to make tonight a big turn of show for the Prime Minister.
And as the Prime Minister finally took the stage, he brushed off the controversies with a smile and pointed his finger directly at the press.
התקשורת והשמאל שמשרת אותה, קשה להם לקבל את זה. אז הם מייצרים אין סוף פרשיות, אין סוף כתבות, אין סוף כותרות, כדי שאולי משהו יתפוס. אם לא צוללות, אז סיגרים. אם לא סיגרים, אז שיחות עם מול. אם לא תיק 1,000, אז תיק 2,000. אם לא 2,000, אז 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. הם דורשים מגורמי האכיפה, תנו לנו משהו, לא חשוב מה.
The Likud party seemed committed to ignoring the media's accusations of corruption, but clearly the night's festivities are precisely the headline they're hoping Israelis will read instead. For ILTV, this is Brett Allen-Smith.
Well, it looks like the White House is finally showing their support for the Taylor Force Act, which was passed last week by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Now, this bill aims to cut the portion of U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority that gets rerouted to pay the families of terrorists or so-called martyrs. With us in the studio for more of this ongoing story is ILTV's Aaron Porras. Hello, Aaron. So tell us about what the White House is now saying.
So when Trump's team is throwing their full support behind the bill, but tentatively, which is an interesting thing to say, that they're throwing their full support tentatively.
Right.
But essentially they're saying, it passed the Foreign Relations Committee, like you said, in a vote by 14-7, massive accomplishment. Mm-hmm. And then the Trump White House is essentially saying, we will back this as long as it doesn't jeopardize chances for peace in the Middle East.
Well, it's definitely felt like the White House has been rather silent about this entire bill in the first place, which is surprising, and it's specifically because of that issue.
Sure.
You know, they don't want to look like they are somehow coming out against the Palestinians.
Exactly, but at the same time, they've made it very clear that they will not tolerate paying and funding for terrorists, even indirectly.
Right, well, certainly President Trump does not want to harm U.S. relations with either the Palestinians or the Israelis, but let's check out your report.
The Taylor Force Act has been gaining momentum across the aisles in the United States, and it's now full steam ahead on its path to become a law, though critics have warned that the bill's passage may undermine the Palestinian Authority by cutting a huge percentage of state funds to the PA. Both Republicans and Democrats seem to agree that America can no longer support Palestinian terror against the State of Israel, even indirectly. Lobbyists for the bill have clarified that the act only denies state funds going to Palestinian families of terrorists or prisoners, but leaves all other humanitarian programs and money intact, hoping to send a clear message against incentivizing terror. This comes at a tenuous time in the peace process and in America's role in brokering peace, so the White House will need to walk a careful line as this bill progresses.
Well, it looks like the fight between Israel and Al Jazeera is ramping up big time. The Israeli government has announced plans to shutter Al Jazeera's offices in Jerusalem once and for all. And now Al Jazeera is firing back, claiming Israel is trying to silence freedom and independent journalism. It looks like they'll be taking the matter to international court. Prime Minister Netanyahu announced his plans on Facebook last month to shut down Al Jazeera, accusing the Arab network of inciting violence on the Temple Mount at the height of the bloody crisis. But things became very real when Israeli Communications Director Ayub Kara announced that the government would be following through and moving forward with closing the offices and revoking reporters' press cards. While it looks like Al Jazeera isn't going down without a fight, they're promising to take this to court, calling Israel's silencing of the media and a legal violation of democracy and freedom of press.
A government which claims to be one of the only democratic ones in existence in the Middle East thinks that in the 21st century it can actually go after journalists and media institutions in order to silence any form of reporting on its actions and its policies that it may not like.
But Israel is just one of several countries that have put the Arab News Network on their blacklist. Arab countries including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates booted Al Jazeera from their borders in an ongoing spat with Qatar, where Al Jazeera is based. And many agree that Al Jazeera seems to be operating as a platform to promote extremist terror.
This is becoming what I would call security concern for Israel, and Israel cannot allow itself actually to be put under the mercy of Al Jazeera.
International rights groups are now rallying behind Al Jazeera, while others are building support for Israel's decision. It looks like the real war is about to begin. All right, the American ambassador to the United Nations is asking the UN to expand its investigation into Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. The UN has over 10,000 troops already policing the situation in the area, but clearly the U.S. doesn't think this is enough. With more on these developments is ILTV's Brett Allen Smith. Now, Brett, what exactly is the ambassador asking the UN to do?
Well, this is a very hot area for Hezbollah, and like you're saying, the UN already has an interim army in place there, specifically to monitor what Hezbollah is actually up to. So what Nikki Haley is getting at is all these reports about illegal weapons making their way into South Lebanon and into the hands of Hezbollah.
And that means a threat not just to Lebanon, also clearly to Israel, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Haley is, of course, one of Israel's biggest defenders in the past, and usually lately they just take the form of little skirmishes, but we're seeing more and more activity, let's say, between Hezbollah and the IDF fighting alongside the border.
Right. All right, well, I'd love to check out the details in your report, so let's take a look.
Cool.
The UN interim force in Lebanon currently has around 10,500 troops stationed in South Lebanon, part of an effort since 1978 to restore peace to the Lebanese government. Now the UN's Security Council is set to vote later this month on renewing the force's presence in the area, with many calling for even more troops to be dispatched. Hezbollah has made the area a stronghold for terror over the years, and lately more and more illegal arms have been finding their way into the hands of Hezbollah foot soldiers. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is making his first visit as UN chief to Israel later this month to look into the matter, just before the council convenes for a vote at the end of August. But Nikki Haley is making America's position very clear, that a weaponized Hezbollah means bad news for both Lebanon and Israel, and that the UN will need to expand its troops if there's any hope of stability in the region.
Well, the final verdicts are in, and now Elor Azaria, the former soldier who was convicted of manslaughter for killing an incapacitated Palestinian attacker, is going to jail. Azaria made a last-minute appeal to delay serving his sentence, but the courts rejected his request, and he is today starting his 18-month stay in prison. You would think the verdict would be a blow to Azaria and his family, but you wouldn't know that from the look of their faces last night. The family partied hard into the night with music and dancing, sending Azaria off to jail in style. And first thing this morning, Azaria reported to military prison to begin serving out his 18-month sentence, greeted by a crowd of supporters chanting, "Elor is a hero."
He made a mistake, but he didn't murder nobody. He murdered a mechabel that need to be killed, and it's a mistake. Okay, he can pay him, not in jail.
But this is just another step in the case that fiercely divided Israel all year. Video footage of Azaria killing an unarmed Palestinian attacker just minutes after he'd been incapacitated by a soldier went viral last year. At his trial, Azaria was convicted of manslaughter charges, which comes with a maximum sentence of 20 years in jail, and many Israelis were outraged when Azaria was given only a year and a half, with the possibility of parole with less than a year. Azaria has now sent a letter to IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot asking for him to reduce his prison time, and is clearly hoping to ride a wave of public support all the way to a pardon from Israeli President Reuven Rivlin. For now, though, Azaria will be sitting in jail, waiting to see what happens next.
Jerusalem was a sight to see on Thursday. Thousands flooded the streets to participate in the city's 16th annual Pride Parade. Joining us to share the details is ILTV's Brett Allen-Smith. Now, Brett, how did it go this year?
Well, fortunately, things went off without a hitch this year. And as you'll see in the footage in just a second, it was a really happy parade this year. This is, of course, very welcome news because wounds are still pretty fresh from an event that happened 2 years ago. In the 2015 parade, of course, an ultra-Orthodox man stabbed and murdered a teenager who was in the festival.
Yeah, and I think what was so shocking about that very incident was that it could have been preventable, right?
Yeah.
But let's check out your report for some more details.
Though the parade's been a yearly event since the city's first Pride March in 2001, it's always caused friction between Jerusalem's secular and Orthodox communities. For the conservative ultra-Orthodox, public displays of homosexuality are outright offensive. Security for the event has been heightened ever since the tragic murder 2 years ago that claimed the life of young Shira Banki, an event that the LGBTQ community is still reeling from. This year, police arrested 12 individuals suspected of trying to disrupt the parade, one of whom was carrying a knife at the time. But though security was high, the marchers strutted their stuff with pride, confidence, and a desire to improve things for the gay community all over Israel.
I'm here in the Jerusalem Pride Parade to march for the LGBT rights, for our rights for freedom, for our rights to live here, to marry, to have children. I'm here to support my community.
It's the most important pride in Israel, basically, because Jerusalem is so divided and everybody knows it's a very complicated city and there is a lot of oppression, so we came here to mostly protest and show that we are here.
Even in the face of harsh opposition and protests against their cause, participants marched on throughout the day, making their voices heard and sending their message for the world to see.
It looks like Israel's beloved Wonder Woman Gal Gadot is going to be making yet another appearance in an upcoming movie. This time around, she'll be featured in the iconic role in the upcoming film Flashpoint, which is the first solo film for the DC Comics character The Flash. The Scarlet Speedster is known for his super speed, which includes the ability to run, move, and think extremely quickly. Add some superhuman reflexes to that, and Flash easily violates the laws of physics. Well, Wonder Wonder Woman will be starring right next to the DC Comics character yet again in the Flashpoint film, which is set to be released in 2020. That means that all the Israelis that already can't stop talking about Gal Gadot will have another 3 years to do just that. The Israeli actress's breakout film Wonder Woman pulled in a whopping $800 million at box offices as of last weekend. And you can see Gadot taking on the role yet again in the upcoming film Justice League, which will release this fall. That's it for this week's Roundup. Tune in next Friday for our next episode of This Week in Israel. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us from Tel Aviv.